In this video, I will identify a new philosophic axiom. I will explain that axiom's role in induction, and then I will identify some further avenues of exploration that this axiom motivates. So what is an axiom? An axiom, in objectivism's view, is a truth which plays a role in our grasp of all other truths. Now, a common way to illustrate this is through a funny exercise called reaffirmation through denial. So here's an example. The axiom existence exists is an axiom. Now, what we're going to show is we're going to have a debate between Alyssa and Dave here. And we're going to show that when Dave argues against existence exists, he's actually reaffirming it by denying it. So let's see how this goes. So Alyssa starts by saying existence exists. Then Dave responds, nonsense, nothing exists. Now Alyssa says, I'm glad you agree with me. And he says, well, you misunderstood me, my good lady. I just said nothing exists. So now Alyssa can say, so you're saying that your statement exists? Well, aren't you a cheeky one? We can see that Dave has been beaten because he's reaffirming that existence exists simply in the act of denying it. Now, this exercise on its own doesn't prove that existence exists as an axiom. What it does is it draws your focus to a particular thing. It draws your focus to the fact that this statement is inherent in every act of cognition. So that's the thing to focus on when you look at reaffirmation through denial. So now I will present to you my new axiom. My new axiom is the good exists. Now, I'm going to illustrate that the good is axiomatic by showing that it too is reaffirmed through denial. So let's imagine a discussion between Dave and me now. So I start by saying the good exists. Dave responds, nonsense, the good does not exist. And I say, do you think that's a fact? Why, yes, of course it's a fact. So you are choosing to believe in the facts as you judge them, including this statement that you just made, that the good does not exist. Why, yes, of course I am. Well, then what that means is that you are choosing to recognize truth and act towards it, to grasp it as you judge the truth, including this statement that you just made. You are choosing to act towards a goal. You are therefore pursuing the good in the act of denying it. Now, what if Dave decides to be difficult? Dave is usually difficult, by the way. What if he says, fine, then I won't choose to believe in the facts as I judge them? Well, then you're not choosing to believe your original statement. You're no longer denying the existence of the good. Blast. So in conclusion, valuing is axiomatic. Or to affirm or disaffirm anything is to value. Or to think is to value. Now remember, reaffirmation through denial per se is not the proof that valuing is axiomatic. I'm just showing you a reaffirmation through denial in order to reveal that valuing is part of any act of cognition. And the way to see this is to look at every act of consciousness and see that every act of consciousness is goal-directed action. That's the actual proof. Reaffirmation through denial just kind of helps you see it. Now, this doesn't tell us specifically what values we should choose. It doesn't indicate what a proper morality is. It just states that man's consciousness is a valuing consciousness. that recognition of a good is present in any act of thinking. To think is to value. Now, this opens up a new field which I will call value-conditioned epistemology. Knowledge is not an end in itself. The purpose of knowledge is to give us power. Now, this is not just a fact about why we should think. It is also a fact which influences how we should think. We've already seen this principle actually applied in my lecture series titled An Inductive Summary of Physics. In that series, I always give the motivation before explaining the inductive proof of a given idea. Now, the reason for this is because values play a role in induction. Here's how. Now, first remember that all inductions, which are beyond just directly perceivable facts like balls rolling and stuff like that, or, here's a dog, any induction past the directly perceivable needs to be proven by reasoning with a prior context of knowledge. So, for example, Copernicus's astronomy built off the astronomy of the Greeks. Later, Newton's laws of gravity were proven by building off of Copernicus, etc. Now, the inductive method, as showcased in An Inductive Summary of Physics, includes values. Includes values as part of the context of knowledge that we actually must identify and reason with as we do induction. Now, this has to be done for two reasons. Number one, our prior context of values should inform what we choose to investigate. There's a lot of facts out there, so we only have a limited amount of time, so we should only choose to focus on facts that we think will improve our lives. And the other way that this influences how induction works is that our prior context of values should inform the way we choose to conceptualize our findings once we have findings. So let's look at the first reason, the first way that values inform epistemology that I know of. And that is that values should inform what we investigate. So here's some examples from the Inductive Summary of Physics. At the beginning of Lecture 1 of the Inductive Summary of Physics, people were motivated to understand the seasons. The reason for this is because winter was a life and death issue. So this motivated knowledge in understanding the cause of the seasons. Later, in the beginning of the second lecture, Galileo begins investigating the heliocentric hypothesis. This is the idea that the sun, not the earth, is at the center of the solar system, and that it is the earth which moves around the sun. Now, think about Galileo's context. Why would he spend time thinking about an idea like that? Especially when it doesn't feel like we're moving. Remember, the heliocentric hypothesis says that the earth is moving and we don't feel like we're moving. So why did Galileo even spend time on this? The reason was, if you go back to those lectures, is specifically because of arguments made by Aristarchus. Aristarchus measured that the sun was much, much larger than the earth. And as a result, he argued that it would make more sense if it was the earth that moved, not the sun. Aristarchus also pointed out that the planets don't make a perfect circle in the night sky. They move like this, which indicates that they might not be going around the earth, but rather going around the sun. And so they don't make a perfect circle around the earth. So Galileo needed to understand all of this prior knowledge in order to even rationally entertain heliocentrism. Thinking is valuing. We can see this at play in these examples. To think about a topic is to value that topic. And that valuing should be explicitly justified. Now let's talk about the second reason, the second way values influence induction that I know of. Values should inform how we conceptualize. So here's an example. There are many ways to conceptualize large numbers. Here are three. So here's one way to conceptualize a large number. You can say 21,049. You can also say 21 grand. You can also say 2.1 times 10 to the fourth power. All three of these perspectives grasp the same fact, the same quantity. So why have three different ways of conceptualizing the same thing? Well, different conceptualizations are motivated by different purposes. For example, 21 grand is helpful when you're, say, trying to buy a car. In such a case, the difference between 21,049 and 21,145, a difference like that is irrelevant. If you hold that in mind, it's just going to clog your brain up with irrelevant information. So as a result, you think in units of 1,000. This car is 21 grand. This car is 19 grand. This one has better wheels. So it takes up less mental space and allows you to make decisions between things that are priced in that price range. Okay. Now, the actual number, when you give out all the digits, that's good when you need an exact number. It's good when you're trying to figure out exactly what it is you owe the dealer, for example. Now, the scientific notation, 2.1 times 10 to the fourth, this is good for physics, especially since it immediately gives you a sense of scale. If I say 2.1 times 10 to the fourth, I know that that's roughly the size of a trip across town. I know that it's not roughly the size of a trip across the earth. That would be 10 to the seventh. It's not roughly the size of a trip across the solar system. That would be 10 to the 12th. And it's not on the scale of an atom, which is 10 to the negative 11th. So the scientific notation gives us an immediate sense of scale. So particular conceptualizations, particular ways of carving up the world must be justified. And part of that justification is the facts, of course. The concept has to be consistent with the facts. But another part of that justification is values. The induction of an idea, therefore, requires both the context of knowledge and the context of values which motivated that particular conceptualization. Now, to give another example of this, there are actually many ways of conceptualizing Newtonian physics. There's force, momentum, and energy. That's just three of them. And the inductive summary of physics actually provided motivation as part of the induction for all three of these conceptualizations. So, for example, force and kinematics, this is classic Newtonian physics. Force and kinematics was motivated by wanting to know the trajectory of objects, like planets. The concept of momentum, on the other hand, which conceptualizes the same set of facts as force and kinematics, that was formed when investigating collisions. In a collision, you aren't able to measure or calculate the actual forces involved, so you instead take on a momentum perspective, and that actually allows you to make predictions even when you don't know the forces involved. And during my induction of energy, I showed that I first motivated an investigation, or rather, I motivated this particular conceptualization of motion by showing that scientists wanted to keep track of how forces were transferred through and magnified by machines. So that's what led to that particular conceptualization. And without understanding the purpose that some of these conceptualizations serve, it's really hard or sometimes even impossible to understand advanced conceptualizations like these. Again, thinking is valuing. So your reason for studying a topic influences and should influence the way you conceptualize its contents. So, that is some introduction to the realm of value-conditioned epistemology. I'm going to finish this video by showing you, by just opening up a few unexplored territories, a few questions which are raised by this new axiom and this new field. So the first question I'm going to raise is, what is the proper relationship between ethics and epistemology? See, this new idea raises a kind of problem. It raises a kind of problem. On one hand, the identification of objective values requires the right epistemology. You need to know how to know in order to identify the good objectively, scientifically. But if all of your investigations, including investigations into epistemology, reason with a prior context of values, then isn't that circular logic? So in a future video, I'm going to identify and explain the proper relationships between values and epistemology to resolve this paradox. Now, this actually leads us to our second question. The philosopher and psychologist Jordan Peterson actually understands this same issue, but he has used it as a rationalization for mysticism. What Jordan Peterson argues is that we cannot derive values objectively from scientific facts because our grasp of those facts is actually conditioned by values. He makes the same argument. He then argues, rightly, that even if we can't prove our values, man still needs values. So he concludes that we should just embrace the values which are already embedded in the culture. And those values are, of course, mystical in nature. So what has happened is that he has an unanswered argument for mystical values. And this is an argument which is completely immune from the scientific argument that there's no observational evidence for anything mysticism claims. It overcomes that argument. And Jordan Peterson has used this argument against both objectivists and Sam Harris, both of whom think that you can derive values from facts. And Jordan Peterson has yet to be refuted from an objectivist perspective. Now, this is a big deal in objectivism's battle for the culture. If objectivism is going to win, it needs counterarguments to all existing opposition. So in a future video, I'll be using an understanding of the proper relationship between values and epistemology to refute Jordan Peterson. And finally, one last question that I'll share with you is, how can we use value-conditioned epistemology to help us achieve objectivity? And there's two examples I'll tell you here. First is in introspection. In general, you need to be aware of your values when you think. Or what's going to happen is you're going to be reasoning with material which comes from unchecked value assumptions. So and as a result, you won't be objective because you're reasoning from stuff you haven't checked. So here's an example. Imagine a man who feels insecurities about his height. What someone like that might do is start doing like internet research about okay, what's the average male height around the world? So if he does this, he might actually end up coming to the right number for the average male height around the world. And in that sense, he's being objective because maybe he did his research properly. But he's not being objective in the sense that he didn't ask himself, what do I have to gain from this information? Why do I feel like getting the answer to this question? If he were to ask those kinds of introspective questions, he would find the values which were leading him to do the research to begin with. He might gain knowledge which would improve his psychology. Now, I'm probably not going to make a video on this topic, but I would invite psychologists to make videos on this topic by building off of my coming work in value conditioned epistemology. And secondly, and this is what I'll focus on, is how we can use value in conditioned epistemology to achieve objectivity in induction. Again, because your values influence what you investigate and how you conceptualize, you actually have to introspect as a scientist too. You have to identify and justify your values in order to maintain scientific objectivity during an investigation. And this aspect is going to be a major theory, a major element in my theory of induction. Okay, so to summarize, the good is an axiomatic concept. To think is to value. 2, values should influence the way that we think. And this is a new field which I am calling value-conditioned epistemology. And thirdly, value-conditioned epistemology has raised a few new questions. First is the proper relationship between values and epistemology. Second is the need for a refutation of Jordan Peterson, because as it stands, Jordan Peterson has an unanswered argument against the objectivist metaethics. And thirdly, we can use the field of value-conditioned epistemology to help us achieve objectivity in both science and our personal lives. So, I hope you'll join me in future videos as I explore these issues further. Thanks for watching.